The Northern Cape is South Africa's biggest province, covering almost a third of the country's surface area. But despite its huge size, it actually has the smallest population of all the provinces. Well known for its diamond mines, big farming community, breathtaking views like the Agrabes Falls National Park, and a beautiful coastline. It has an arid climate with little rain, with some residents even describing it as exhaustingly hot. In Northern Cape is the city of Kimberley, and just a couple of miles outside you can find the small, sleepy and rural hamlet of Kriegstad, which is where this episode takes us. Back to April 6, 2012. That evening, a small pickup truck came hurtling towards the police station in Kriegstad, screeching to a halt outside. A young boy got out and ran in shouting, "They're all dead. They're all dead." He was covered in blood. The boy was 15-year-old Don Steenkamp. The Steenkamps were a very successful and wealthy family, owning 5 farms in total that were generations old. They were prominent and powerful and big in the community, and everyone in the station knew that surname. Don told detectives that his entire family had been shot to death, and he had just managed to escape. He had been in the barn for a while when he suddenly heard gunshots coming from inside his home. They rang out so loudly, echoing through the vast space, and he recalled hearing multiple shots before it went quiet. He started running for the house, and inside he found his mother, 43-year-old Crystal, father, 44-year-old Dion, and his younger sister, 14-year-old Martella. There was blood everywhere. He said Martella was still just alive and he tried to pick her up, but she had died there and then in his arms. He ran for his father's truck, and as he pulled away he heard more shots ringing out. As he got to the main gates he saw 2 guns on the ground. He picked them up and put them into the truck. He then pulled over briefly to warn other farm workers, some of which were employees of the Steenkamps, before speeding away to the station. Police let him wash his hands and change his clothes, and he stayed there with them, while other detectives rushed over to the sprawling farm in question, Nulvuk, just a short drive from Kriegstad. When they got there, they could see that the lights were still on, but it was eerily silent. No windows were smashed, and there was no signs of forced entry that they could see. They called out, but no one called back. When they got inside, they saw Dion lying near the living room, just a few feet away from Crystal and Martella, who were lying closely together near the kitchen. They were all dead, and it looked as if everything had happened so quickly. They had only just finished up with dinner when the attacks took place and the television was still on. Ballistics experts confirmed that all 3 had been shot both by a revolver and a rifle. The revolver was used first and the final shots came from the rifle. Dion had 3 gunshot wounds, 1 to the right shoulder, 1 behind the ear and another in the chest. Crystal was shot in the shoulder, neck and back, and Martella was shot twice in the body and twice in the head. Martella and Dion had blunt force injuries to their heads too, likely caused by the other side of the gun. One thing that the authorities would keep close to their chests and not publicly announce for a long time was that examinations performed by 2 doctors confirmed that Martella had also been raped between 12 and 24 hours before her death. The most recent injury she had sustained had actually reopened an old injury that had previously healed. Experts said that this showed she had been raped at least twice in her life. The injuries to Martella from that night showed that she was attacked in a far more violent way than her parents, and in the words of the authorities, she fought for her life like a tiger. Her wounds in particular were described as gruesome and torturous. Blood covered the walls and the kitchen countertops, and there was a big pool of blood outside by one of the trees. The blood by the tree was Martella's. Looking at the blood, the wounds, and the placement of their bodies, they believed that Crystal had been shot first from behind. Martella was shot second and, badly injured, she ran out the back door, leaving her blood outside. Dion was next. The position of his injuries made the experts think that he had made an attempt to run at his attacker to try and stop them, before being shot again and hit over the head. Satisfied that Dion was dead, the killer or killers then went to hunt for Martella, who was hiding and bleeding under a tree. She was then shot right in the face and struck over the head, which caused a significant amount of blood to gather there. All of these shots had been fired using a revolver. The killer then made their way back into the house to get a rifle and, remarkably, Martella, who was still alive, managed to stumble back into the house, where she saw her parents. Her bloody handprint was found on the house phone as she had tried to call for help. She then grabbed her father's arm and tried to pull him towards her, but she fell to the floor by her mum Crystal. The killer then returned with the rifle and shot all of them one final time. Everything about this attack felt so personal, especially when it came to Martella. It was a harrowing set of visuals, and even the most hardened of officers said that tears filled their eyes as they looked at the scene and realized just how defenseless the family would have been and how frightening their last moments were, especially Martella's. but they quickly pulled it together as this was now a huge murder investigation. The first thing that came to many people's minds was that it was a farm attack. Farm attacks have been prevalent in South Africa for years, and even though the Northern Cape is firmly in the position as the safest province when it comes to these attacks, they do still happen there. However, journalists said that although they can go this badly, crimes this brutal seldom happened in this location, and the stories that make the papers were more petty crime or drug or alcohol related. The Steenkamp's house was big, and there were a lot of belongings to account for, but it didn't seem that anything was actually missing except a kitchen knife and some keys. A few of the couple's safes were open, with the keys still dangling in the keyhole, but they still had things in them. There was cash on the side amounting to about 32,000 rand, just over 1,000 pounds, along with the couple's credit cards. TVs, laptops, and phones were all there too, and Dion and Crystal's cars were still in the barn area with the keys in the ignition. None of these items were hidden, they were just out in the open, and all added up these were things that could make someone a lot of money, so why hadn't they been taken? The couple's gun safe was also wide open too, but it was still full of guns and ammunition. Experts said it didn't seem that a robbery was the motive, so this was ruled out. Despite a rumor circulating that Dion had killed his wife and daughter before turning the gun on himself, this theory was also eliminated. The news of what had happened was now spreading like wildfire. People could not believe that they had been with them just hours before at church. And now this had happened. Dion and Crystal had no enemies, no disgruntled employees that police could find, no one they owed money to, and no one in the community that even had anything bad to say about them. Leading the team was the provincial head of organized crime at the time, Colonel Dick Duval, and with 3 decades of experience, he was the best person to tackle such a complex case. He went back to the farm with Don so he could walk him through what had happened. Duval set a timer up as well, so he could get a clearer picture of when this had actually taken place. Don told him he thought he was in the barn for about 45 minutes. He had left Dion and Martella watching a show together and Crystal was working on the computer. He then heard the shots. He stayed still for about 10 minutes waiting for silence before running inside. When he found his sister, he picked her up and held her. In her final moments, she said she loved him, before falling to the floor and grabbing at his t-shirt, which had been ripped. But this was not the t-shirt he had come into the station with. Don then walked them to his bedroom and picked up the ripped t-shirt to show them. They noticed some scratches on his neck, and he admitted that he and Martella had had a fight only a couple of hours before everything had happened. They asked what the fight was about, but he said he couldn't remember. They asked why he had taken the shirt off and changed, and he said that the sight of his sister's blood had repulsed him, so he had to get it off. He said after this, he ran back into the barn and hid, waiting for a few minutes before getting into his father's truck. He pointed out where he found the guns outside and where he had stopped to talk to the workers. He had then made the 4-mile drive to the police station. Everything was being tested, but there was a lot to get through and it was a slow process. There were a few fingerprints on one of the drinking glasses found outside near the back door, but testing would confirm they were simply Martella's. Sadly, not all of the evidence was preserved and able to be tested. There was a green Jeep jacket belonging to Dion and a rug both covered in blood. But the day after the murders, Crystal and Dion's cleaners had burned them. Members of the Steenkamp family had even hired a private investigator to try and help them, but they were drawing a blank too. A few workers in the area said they had seen a white Audi with a broken mirror speeding around. A few of them even said they believed there had been a crash involving this car. The team went back, but they found no broken mirror fragments near the alleged accident site, and this lead went nowhere. The farm attack was still on people's minds, but the police weren't so sure. Nothing of value had been taken, and there was no forced entry. 2 big things that didn't make sense. The family also had 4 dogs which were found alive and well. Don had not mentioned hearing them barking at anything, and in a lot of farm attacks, experts said that dogs were often poisoned or subdued before these attacks took place. And it seemed clear that whoever the killer was, they knew the layout of the home, something a random intruder would not. Detectives also felt confident that they were looking for just one perpetrator. As the investigation continued, the family's funeral was held. Don sat in the front row with his grandparents, giving hugs to everyone that walked past. Everybody was heartbroken for the 15-year-old. In a matter of minutes, he had lost his parents and sister in the most traumatic of ways, and his life was irreparably changed. Everyone said that Dion and Crystal adored their children, and they all had a comfortable and nice life, wanting for nothing. But despite their wealth, they were very humble and modest and never shied away from hard work, an important trait they wanted their children to have too. Dion's sister joked that Don was Crystal's favorite, but Martella was definitely a daddy's girl. People said that when they first met, Dion was such a big man with a big presence he looked intimidating. But the moment you spoke to him, he was a teddy bear and a real softie. He coached under 18s teams in tent pegging, an equestrian sport that is popular in the area, was a church deacon and was part of the farming union too. A proud man and someone very dedicated to his community. Crystal loved gardening and had recently started her own baking business. Don and Martella had both attended boarding school just over 200 miles away. But Dion and Crystal made sure they came home most weekends, driving there and back to drop them off and pick them up. They never minded the long drives though, because family time meant everything and they didn't like being apart for weeks at a time. Teachers said Martella was a dream student and a total perfectionist with everything she did. Her school paid tribute to the 14-year-old as well, and the pain her friends and fellow students felt was clear to see. Another person who was trying to piece things together was Joe Skultz. He was in charge of rural safety in the farming union and was often a spokesperson if things like this happened. He unfortunately looked at and helped investigate many a farm attack, but he said in his experience what had happened to his neighbors and friends did not tick those same boxes. The police knew Skultz well, and he had been allowed into the house on the night of the murders. He said Martella's face was beaten and swollen, and she didn't even look like a person anymore, let alone someone he knew and had watched grow up. The attack was so violent he had never seen anything like it. Experts would later confirm that the same guns that Don had found outside and taken to the station with him were the murder weapons. But if he found the weapons 50 meters away outside, how could he have heard more shots coming from inside as he drove away? And if Don had been in the bar before the shootings happened, surely he would have seen or heard the killer coming. In a space that vast and rural, cars would be needed to get away, again making more noise and drawing more attention. Authorities already knew that Martella had fled outside to hide by the tree, a tree that was just a few steps away from the barn. How could Don not have heard her when he was so close? And if he had been trying to save his little sister like he had claimed, why would he talk about her blood repulsing him so much? Surely he wouldn't have been focused on that. Why would he spend time changing his clothes in a house that was under attack with a killer on the loose? Gunpowder residue tests done on 2 of Don's shirts recovered from the house came back as positive. All of this, along with the fact that there was no forced entry, no other DNA, the dogs hadn't reacted and nothing had been stolen, meant just one thing. The attention was now firmly on the only surviving person from that night. 15-year-old Don Steenkamp. Was it possible that the same boy that had come running into the station, hysterical, had actually been the one to commit the crime? But why, they wondered. The rape of Martella presented this potential motive. Don had sexually assaulted his sister and then killed his family to cover it up when she threatened to expose him. And then there was the cell phone analysis. Data from Crystal's phone showed that she sent a text message to Martella at 6:34 p.m. Nothing serious, just a short message about an upcoming holiday. But this was crucial in terms of the timings. This meant that the murders had to have taken place after 6:34 p.m. and if Don was already at the station at 6:50 p.m., this would have meant someone breaking in and murdering everyone happened in just 16 minutes. This did not match Don's timeline, and he would have been unable to do everything he claimed he had done in the small window. They also found it an impossible idea for the killer and Don to not have run into each other in those few minutes. And if he had actually heard more shots ringing out as he sped away, that would mean the killer was still in the house and would undoubtedly have crossed paths with Don as he was going in and out. They felt the only way you would feel safe to stay in the house long enough to change your clothes is if you knew no one dangerous was actually in there. Blood splatter analysis also did not link with his version of Martella grabbing his shirt as he tried to help her. In fact, the splatter pattern on his shirt proved that he had been close to her when the shots were fired. It would have looked totally different if it was a smear of blood or a transfer as he held her. An expert said that Martella would in all likelihood have been too weak to tear his shirt, so they felt confident that this had been torn as he attacked her and she tried to defend herself. Police felt it was possible for Don to kill them all in several minutes, quickly change, throw the guns in the truck, then drive just a few minutes to the station. More texts from after the murders had also been analyzed. These were texts between Don and one of his friends. Who do they suspect? Only me. Are there no other fingerprints? No, only mine. Is there no other evidence to find someone else? No, they're not going to find anyone else. At this point, even Dion's sister said she suspected her nephew, but couldn't quite fathom it. She said consoling him whilst also questioning his actions was surreal. She was still hoping she was wrong. On August 21, 2012, Dick DeVole arrived at Don's school with handcuffs. Detectives working the case said they had exhausted every other possible line of inquiry. They felt they had been as thorough as they could be before they presented their case. Even they didn't want to think that the 15-year-old son and brother could have done this to his own family. But after 4 months, copious and time-consuming investigations, tests and expert opinions, they just could not draw any other conclusion. The now 16-year-old Don Steenkamp was placed under arrest in his head teacher's office. Don was walked through the school to the car, with other students watching on. Don just stared ahead. He didn't seem angry or upset. He was blank. Duvall was driving to the station when a breaking news announcement came over the radio. Duvall said he discreetly glanced at him through the mirror to see his reaction. He said a slight smirk flickered across his face before he went back to staring into space. Don Steenkamp was charged with 3 counts of murder and 1 count of defeating the ends of justice. He would also later be charged with the rape of his sister Martella. He pleaded not guilty to all 5 charges. In early September, Don was granted bail so he could carry on with his schoolwork. People in the school said that Don had always been rather quiet and sometimes even slightly withdrawn, but after his family's murders he was like a different person. He was chatty, confident to the point of arrogant, and loved the attention this was all bringing him, especially from girls. Teachers said it was a far cry from the teen just a couple of months ago. But while on bail, he was forced to drop out of school as some of the other parents were piecing things together and looking at him as a suspect. There were soon so many complaints about him being back in the school that his head teacher asked him to leave. So although his name and face were technically concealed, many people had long been talking and connecting the dots. A psychologist assessed Don during this time and said he had no history of aggression and exhibited no symptoms of having any kind of behavioral disorder or mental health issues. She said from talking to him, she didn't think anyone could have predicted this. Another psychologist added that Don showed good character, was respectful, had positive attributes, and formed good relationships with people. There were no red flags, so to speak. She said that in most cases where children kill their families or parents, it is because they are a victim of chronic abuse. Sources say that although Dion could be strict, from what they saw it was no more than most parents, and was nothing to suggest any abuse was happening in the home. Don himself emphatically stated to one expert that his parents were never abusive towards him. In order for the trial to go ahead, legal fees had to be sorted out. In October 2013, the Northern Cape High Court agreed to release 500,000 rand of inheritance bequeathed to Don so that the trial could start. The funds were released through the last will and testament of Don's grandfather. The court did not allow any funds that would have come from the estates of Dion and Crystal. In South Africa, the jury system in courts was abolished in 1969, so it was down to the Northern Cape Judge President Frans Kolmel to make a decision on whether or not he was guilty. Since his arrest, a court order had prevented Don's name from being released. Cameras were allowed in the courtroom, which is why we see him inside, but ones of his face were not published. And a lot of the time, it was just the back of him that was shown to the media. As the trial started, things were thrown into question when police got an alleged confession from 3 sources, 2 women and a man. It was reported that one of the women, who was at the time already in custody for possession of explosives and ammunition, said that the Steenkamp murders were part of a plan to attack white farmers in an attempt to instill fear and incite racial hatred. But the police said there was absolutely no truth to this and not a shred of evidence that supported it. The prosecution felt that they had a strong case and they had almost 100 witnesses that they intended to call. They presented their motives and timelines. Don had raped his sister Martella and she had threatened to tell her parents. Don had shot them all to cover this up. And the fact that Martella was involved in a struggle prior to her death also supported the theory that the murders had something to do with her assault. The judge, experts, and police all felt sure that the person that had raped her was also her killer. And if she was assaulted 12 to 24 hours before she was killed, what were the chances that this happened and then the intruder came back a day later to kill everybody? Another motive was the fact that Don was set to inherit 23 million rand, the equivalent of almost £1 million or $1.3 million at the time. He also stood to get Martella's portion as well. A day after the killings, one of the first things he asked a psychologist was how his inheritance would be worked out and said he knew all about his family's finances and what he was entitled to. Don did testify himself, and the judge said he showed himself to be a poor witness, and under cross-examination his story was easily discredited. But even when he was caught out in a blatant lie, he seemed totally unfazed. One journalist said they kept looking for some form of emotion, but Don gave them nothing except being arrogant to the judge. On one of the days, everybody went down to the farm to get a clearer picture of where everything was. When the judge saw where Don had allegedly found the weapons, he commented that this made the killer the dumbest farm attacker in South Africa. To kill the family, run for the exit, drop the murder weapons, and then run back in. He added that if the only thing that was stolen was a knife, it must have been a diamond-encrusted one. To have been worth taking over everything else in the house. But Don's defense team said in their eyes, it still pointed more towards an intruder than Don. They said that the only real theory they had as a motive was the rape. But they doubted whether this had even happened despite 2 doctors confirming it had. They even went as far to say that Martella could have caused the wounds and bruising in and around her genitals herself. They also pointed out that there was no semen found, but given that it was 12 to 24 hours later, the state said this didn't really prove anything. The analysis from the doctors was enough to prove it. After several weeks and a tough trial for the family to sit through, the judge returned his verdict. He found Don guilty of the premeditated murders of Dion, Crystal, and Martella, and the rape of Martella. He was also found guilty of defeating the ends of justice, also known as preventing justice or perverting the cause of justice. The judge said he was also totally convinced that this was not the first time that Martella was a victim of Don's sexual abuse. In his final statements, the judge said, "I am satisfied that no one other than the minor accused committed all the offenses listed in the indictment, as the state has in fact proved them, not only beyond a reasonable doubt, but beyond any shadow of a doubt. To deal with all aspects proved against the minor would amount to an overkill. The murders were not only premeditated, but were in fact planned and executed with the direct intent to murder." He added, "In my view, the minor, the torturer, wanted to have sexual intercourse with Martella. When she refused, she was consequently tortured, raped, and murdered to prevent her from reporting it. Her parents had to be eliminated. There would be no reason for Martella to inform anyone of the sexual activity if a consensual love relationship existed between her and the accused. The truth is, he is the architect of his own misfortune. He is the one who raised the alarm with the police and cried wolf." During his sentencing, he told Don to face the consequences of his actions. 2 days later, Don turned 18, and with this, the order preventing his name from being released was lifted. People were stunned, but others that had questioned the crime scene in the first place, like Joe Skultz, said it sadly explained so much that they hadn't been able to explain any other way. When it came to the sentencing, a legal expert said that the South African justice system did not really give life sentences or sentences exceeding 20 years for children under the age of 18. The maximum sentence he would be facing was 25 years. Both rape and murder are classified as Schedule 6 offenses. However, when it comes to minors, it is entirely left to the discretion of a judge to decide on a suitable sentence. All sentences would run concurrently, making it 20 years in total. He reacted to nothing as the verdict was read out. Stony-faced, he hugged some family members goodbye before he was led away. The judge said that whatever happened to him after this was none of his concern. In line with the Correctional Services Act, will serve at least half of the sentence before he can apply for parole, which is 10 years. This does not mean that he will get parole after those 10 years, just that he cannot apply before then, and 10 years will take us to 2024. His age at the time of the killings will not have any impact on future parole considerations, because the judge already took that into consideration with his sentencing. Even if he qualified for parole after 10 years, there will still be other guidelines and regulations that could play a role, like inputs from family members, for example. He has also since been investigated in prison for breaking rules, and things like this will factor in too. Legal experts said if it wasn't for his age at the time, which constricted the judge in the sentence he could give, he might have been given a lifelong sentence. An appeal was filed, but Don needed to have his first legal bill settled from the trial and then find a team to take it on. People have always been split on what they believe, even his own family. His grandmother Betty said although she believed he was innocent for so long, the evidence against him was just too strong, and she had accepted that he was guilty, but that she also forgave him. She hoped that he could get the necessary psychiatric and psychological help so that one day he could make a positive contribution to society. Dion's sister Mariana said that she has to simply make peace with the outcome and accept it. Neighbors like Joe Skultz, who believe he is guilty, said if Don could admit that he did it and tell people why, it would give them the closure they all need, and they might be able to move forward, maybe even forgiving him one day. This brought an end to a truly unprecedented case that had been on everyone's mind for almost 2 years. Known to many as the Rikvestad Farm murders, it dominated the media for ages and left a lasting imprint on Northern Cape and further afield. Jacques Steenkamp, who was of no relation to the family, followed the trial and the family's journeys and wrote a best-selling book about the case, which was then made into a film in 2019. People likened that day in April to feeling like a horror movie in itself. Judge Franz Kalmer later retired, but was appointed inspecting judge of the Directorate for Priority Crime Investigations, also known as the Hawks. And sadly, in 2021, Dick Duval, who had played such a vital part in bringing this case to a close, passed away after a short illness. It is safe to say that there will forever be so many unanswered questions about that day, and closure for the family left behind may always be so far away. Dawn has not spoken about that day but still denies having any part in it. So what actually happened on the farm on the April 6th, 2012 will likely never be known, and everyone will remain in the dark. One psychiatrist said that over time and with more assessments, a personality disorder or mental health issue might arise and show itself, which could give a clearer insight into his mind at the time, but there is also a good possibility that this will never happen. She said, whatever happened on that day is locked in his head, and if he hasn't said it yet, I don't think he'll ever say. I think the story was truly buried on that day. April 4th, 2007. April Jones is born to parents Coral and Paul. She was a bright and happy little girl who was the apple of her family's eye. It was discovered she had cerebral palsy when she was very young and required daily medication. But in spite of this, she lived her life to the absolute fullest, bringing joy to everyone she met. Her family said she ruled the roost with a cheeky nature whilst also being kind and loving. She loved the outdoors and would often be out riding her bike with her friends. She was also a hard worker in school and was popular amongst her classmates and teachers. On September 30th, 2012, April received a glowing report about how well she was progressing in primary school. Due to having such a fantastic school report the previous day, April was allowed to have some extra time to play outside. April was out playing with her friends near her home on the Brynagog estate. At 7:20, a Land drove a scene driving away from McClintock at speed. Just 9 minutes later, a frantic 999 call is made. The 999 dispatcher wasted no time by deploying police straight away, and within 8 minutes the first officer had arrived on scene. She spoke to a witness, April's 7-year-old friend who she had been out with. She was able to provide a brief description. The man who had taken April had brown hair, a beard, blue or green eyes, and was wearing a green jacket or jumper, jeans and trainers. She also described the vehicle, and one thing immediately stood out to investigators. Her friend said that April had gotten into the driver's side door, meaning the car steering wheel must have been on the left-hand side of the car, when most cars in the United Kingdom will have the steering wheel on the right. Following this information, a critical incident was launched by the police. As it was an alleged abduction, the police needed to pursue as many lines of inquiry as possible to try and ascertain exactly where April was, knowing time was of the essence. That day had started like any other. April's older sister described it as being a normal day. April had gone to her swimming lesson as usual, and then skipped out of the changing rooms to head home. Despite it being October, the sun was out and it was a nice warm evening. April's older sister had gone to the youth club, when at around 7:30 p.m. she received a frantic phone call from her mother screaming down the phone that April was gone. As the sun started to set, panic began to escalate. The response from the community was massive and immediate. As news started to spread on social media that April was missing, people began to come out of their homes to try and assist in any way they could, and show support to the Jones family. But this made door-to-door inquiries for the police incredibly difficult, as so many weren't at their addresses and officers were only able to ask them questions once they returned. When her older sister arrived home from the youth club, she was hoping that April would be home by now. Instead, her distraught mother was out looking for her and police were combing the area. As the search efforts continued to mount, the media became aware that a 5-year-old girl had allegedly been abducted. The eyes of the country were fixated on the small little Welsh community, as it had been rocked by something so out of the ordinary. By 10:30 p.m., the police had put out an update saying they were increasingly concerned for April and were appealing for any information that could help find her. Hundreds of local volunteers gathered to join in the search after the news started to spread on Twitter and Facebook. Also high on the priority for the police was helping to support her devastated family. Police revealed more information about the circumstances of April's disappearance and said she was last seen wearing a purple coat and her school polo top. Refuge collection was suspended as workers joined in the hunt too. Hour by hour, more people came out to help with the search, culminating in more than 100 local residents. The town, with a population of just over 2,000, was inundated with volunteers, with some traveling from South Wales and the north of England. Police said they wanted to make sure that search volunteers were used in a coordinated and effective way. April's family weren't allowed to take part in the searches in case they came across something, so the local community stepped up to help. One problem the search teams immediately ran into was the terrain. The extensive countryside, mountains, gorges, streams, waterfalls, and uneven ground made it an incredibly difficult place to search. There were slate mines in the area too, and all of these factors mixed with the rain presented a huge challenge for those trying to find April. An area of more than 60 square kilometers was searched, and there were more than 300 specific search areas. The police knew that if April had been abducted by a stranger, every second was vital to try and find her safe and well. 8 hours on from the initial 999 call being made, the police and community were still out searching, trying to find April Jones. 120 search officers were out and searched through the night. The morning after she had gone missing, they decided to activate the Child Rescue Alert, which puts on notice all police forces up and down the United Kingdom to be on the lookout for any unusual sightings of individuals who fit the description of April Jones and the person who had allegedly abducted her. Information was being distributed to other forces, including descriptions of both April and the alleged abductor, as well as the car her friend saw her getting into. This was the first time the Child Rescue Alert had been triggered nationwide. It had now been 14 hours since she had last been seen, and there was still no sighting of the missing 5-year-old. Missing posters started to go up around the area, and police began to set up roadblocks to stop vehicles. As the investigation continued escalating, the police force found themselves under mounting pressure from the media to release more information. Press conferences were being held every few hours, and sometimes journalists were given very little notice that they were about to take place. As the search continued, it was the task of Andy John, the detective superintendent, to try and find April's alleged abductor. After the friend of April had been allowed to rest, the police went back to try and get a more detailed description of exactly what she had seen when April went missing. It became clear that April had got into the vehicle with the assistance of the person driving, but it wasn't clear whether or not she knew them. Due to April having cerebral palsy, she wouldn't have been able to get into the car unaided. During the morning of the 2nd of October, just one day after April had gone missing, the information continued to come through, and it all started to point to one individual. A local man named Mark Bridger. He wasn't someone who was known to local police. They received information that Mark Bridger and his vehicle had been in the area around the time the abduction was thought to have taken place. What immediately caught their eye about his vehicle was that it was a left-hand drive, just like April's friend had described. There had been information to suggest that Mark Bridger had actually been part of the search party that was out looking for April. More units were deployed, and the police helicopter was also used to try and find him. They had also received information about 4 potential addresses where he could have been staying. Officers went to the property simultaneously 20 hours after she had been reported missing, but could find no trace of April Jones or Mark Bridger. When they pulled up outside one of the properties, a cottage called Mount Pleasant, at 3 minutes past 3 in the afternoon, there were no vehicles at the house. An investigator went inside and called out April's name. There was no response. Bridger had only moved into Mount Pleasant 5 weeks before. At 4:30 p.m., the police made an announcement. Mark Bridger had been arrested. Police gave details of the arrest, saying he was detained while walking his dog along the side of the road after being spotted by the police helicopter at 10:42, a couple of miles away from where April had lived. Not once did he lift his gaze to look up at the police helicopter that was circling above him. He had also attempted to alter his appearance by cutting his hair and shaving off his beard. It was about 30 minutes later that Bridger was spotted by a patrol car. After confirming his name to the officer, Bridger turned and said, "I know what this is all about." The police constable asked him, "Where is she?" Bridger replied, "It was an accident. I crushed her with my car. I don't know where she is." He was immediately arrested. Officers described him as being an emotional wreck. Despite being told he didn't have to say anything, Bridger said he needed to talk. "I've been looking for her all night and today on foot because my vehicle is in the garage. It is a left-hand drive Land Rover Discovery. I didn't abduct her. I did my best to revive her. Panicked. I didn't even know until this morning who she was until I saw the television. I just wish I knew what I'd done to her, where I put her. I want to say sorry to the family. There was no life in her. No response. No breath. No response in her eyes. She was just on the seat. I tried to revive her. I would not have dumped her. She is a human being." He was transferred to Aberystwyth Police Headquarters. The station was shut down to all of the prisoners to ensure that the teams could be properly housed there and focus completely on the investigation. Following his arrest, Coral made an emotional plea to the public for their help to try and find April. Alongside Detective Superintendent Reg Bevan, police said the overnight search involving 40 trained police officers, dog handlers, and mountain rescue teams yielded no news on April's whereabouts. They thanked the public for their efforts but warned of the challenging conditions. Police later revealed the operation had been unprecedented in the UK in terms of scale and terrain. Neighboring forces and specialist teams were helping with a focus on over 20 scenes around the area. The operation led to 600 messages from the public to the police, and a search involved 100 mountain rescue volunteers, 100 police specialist searchers, as well as Coast Guards and the RNLI. It was soon time for the police to start questioning their prime suspect, father of 6, Mark Bridger. Shortly after his interview began, he elaborated further about what he had said upon being arrested. He told the officer that April was dead. He said he had run her over, knocking her off her bike, causing her significant injuries. He said in a state of panic, he had put her into the car and then tried to administer CPR, which had failed. He then said he drove off with April in the vehicle. Bridger stated he then lost his memory and wasn't able to tell investigators where April now was. He claimed he was drunk and could not recall what he had done with April's body, but he was sure he had put her somewhere safe. The police made the decision to not release this information immediately as they needed to verify exactly what was true and whether or not Mark Bridger was being completely honest. Now that Mark Bridger had been arrested, police and crime scene examiners were able to secure his home and conduct a thorough search of the premises to try and uncover any clues as to exactly what had happened to April. Upon going into his home, the stench of detergent and cleaning products was immediately apparent, and was unusually hot, indicating there had been a roaring fire in the living room fireplace very recently. On the footage taken of Bridger by the police helicopter, a plume of smoke could be seen rising through the chimney from the fireplace of his home. But despite the best efforts of investigators, there was no sign of April either in the property or any of the surrounding areas. Andy John made the decision to meet with the family of April Jones on the evening of the 2nd of October to disclose the new information that had come to light. They were absolutely devastated by the news that their beloved April was now most likely never coming home. Throughout his interviews, when challenged with the evidence that had been gathered, he would be emotional and unpredictable. Officers believed these emotions were not genuine, and pointed to him being both a fantasist and a liar. Mark Bridger's confession that she was now dead left those on the force devastated. They had worked through the night through increasingly difficult conditions, clinging on to any small chance that she might still be alive. April's older sister said that while the name Mark Bridger meant nothing to her, as soon as she saw his face on the news, she recognized him. She often saw him out and about, and he used to live not far from them. As the investigation into the disappearance of April Jones moved into its 3rd day, the police still needed to prove that Mark Bridger had murdered her. The investigating officers needed to establish any contact he might have had with April during the abduction, and obtain any forensic evidence they could. When the police seized his vehicle, they could find no evidence of a road traffic collision, and no evidence that the vehicle had struck anybody. Contrary to Bridger's account of April being seriously injured when he put her into the car, forensics could find no blood or traces of blood inside the vehicle. This solidified investigators' thoughts further that Mark Bridger's story of accidentally knocking her off her bike was nothing more than a calculated cover-up of a far more sinister turn of events. As the forensic examination of the car turned up nothing, they turned their attention back to the house, where they believed April had been attacked. They were able to find traces of April's blood inside the home, indicating she had suffered significant injuries at the property. They removed what was left in the fire pit in the living room and were able to find 17 fragments of her skull and 1 fragment in the bathroom plug hole, confirming the worst fears of everyone. Police did not believe that April's whole body was burned, but believed the fragments of bone got into the fire and bath during the cleanup. Searches of his house and laptop indicated that Bridger was a highly dangerous and predatory offender. This helped piece together why he had taken April to satisfy his sinister desires. His internet search history showed that he had an extremely unhealthy interest in children. He had computer folders filled with images of child sexual abuse, graphic depictions of rape, and pictures of previous young murder victims, including Holly Wells and Jessica Chapman, 2 10-year-old girls who were murdered in Soham, and 13-year-old Caroline Dickinson, who was raped and murdered in a French hostel during a school trip. There were some pictures available on his computer which officers believed had been taken from Facebook and other social media of children in the local area, including April and her older sister. Following this discovery, Jasmine remembered that Mark Bridger had actually approached her on social media several months before April was abducted. She was in her living room on her laptop when she got a Facebook notification. A new friend request had come through. It was Mark Bridger. She didn't know him and showed it to her father. Paul knew him from the early 1990s when they had dated sisters, but he couldn't understand why he was adding his daughter. Coral also warned her not to accept the request. Jasmine deleted him, and that was seemingly the end of it. When the news started to spread that the case was now moving from a missing child case to a murder inquiry, around 150 people attended a church vigil for April, led by the Bishop of Bangor, Andy John, and Reverend Rogers. The despair and disappointment was evident. Reverend Rogers said there was over 150 people there, including the police, and we're very, very grateful to them for all that they are doing. It was very silent in there, and it was a very powerful and very moving service. The town was covered in pink ribbons in response to April's mother's appeal for people to wear her daughter's favorite color. Police renewed their appeal for information over suspect Mark Bridger's movements. Following this, investigators revealed that they had received more than 2,500 calls in response to their latest appeal for information. Prime Minister David Cameron said it was every family's nightmare and urged anyone with information to come forward and speak to the police. The time that officers had to question Bridger was rapidly running out. Police had until 5 p.m. to charge or release him. Although they could apply for a further 24 hours warrant of detention, Bridger appeared in court in Aberystwyth at 3:30, where police were given another 24 hours to question him. Once again, the community came out in full force. Around 450 responded to a call for people with good local knowledge to search the villages around where April had lived. Volunteers were told to keep away from the river, the forest, and places such as mine shafts, which were being searched by the specialist teams. On Saturday, the 6th of October, 5 days after April had disappeared, Mark Bridger was charged with abduction, murder, and perverting the course of justice in relation to the attempt to conceal any trace of her body. The district Crown prosecutor from the Crown Prosecution Service said that following a review of everything that had been gathered, he believed they had sufficient evidence to charge Mark Bridger with the murder of April Jones and that it is in the public interest to do so. I have also concluded that there is sufficient evidence to charge the defendant with attempting to pervert the course of justice and child abduction. This announcement led to mixed emotions. On the one hand, there was relief that the perpetrator had been caught, but also heartbreak not only for the Jones family, but for April, whose life had been taken in the most appalling way imaginable. But who exactly was Mark Bridger? He was born on the 6th of November in 1965 in Sutton, Surrey. He was the second of 3 children, and his father had worked as a City of London police constable. After attending secondary school, he went to Croydon College, where he failed to complete a diploma in engineering. Bridger grew into a strong man, a very big build and over 6 foot tall. Accounts from people he worked with described him as sociable, hardworking, and charismatic. Others remarked on his apparent obsession with the military and how he had claimed to be a former Army bomb disposal expert who had changed his identity to protect himself from any retaliation from the Irish Republican Army. He also said he had been a serving member of the SAS. When interviewed by police over April's disappearance, he told them how he had excelled during his military service. But this was nothing more than an utter fantasy. Mark Bridger had never joined the Army or served in the armed forces. Far from being a distinguished veteran, as a teenager he had been in trouble with the police. For example, in the early 1990s he was convicted of criminal damage, affray, and driving with no insurance. In 1984 he became a firefighter in London, but within 6 months he had quit due to what he called personal problems. It was around this time he allegedly split with his partner soon after the birth of their son. The split meant his parents could not get access to their new grandchild, causing a rift from which the family would never recover. Bridger would tell people in later years that his parents were dead. It was at this point that Bridger turned his attention to Wales. He knew South Wales because his grandmother had lived there. He had lived in several places where he had a variety of jobs, including bar work, being a chef, a waiter, a car recovery mechanic, and a forestry worker. After moving repeatedly, he finally settled in Machynlleth. Once there, he had worked a variety of jobs: kitchen assistant as a local hotel, a welder, helping renovate a local guest house, a lifeguard, and a slaughterman in an abattoir. He had 6 children with a number of women, and just days before April was abducted, he had split with his latest girlfriend and was deeply upset about it. He claimed he turned to drink after relationship breakups and had been on antidepressants on and off for 12 years. The attention of women was clearly important to him. Hours before he took April, he contacted 3 women via Facebook, asking if they wanted to meet. No strings attached. They also found in his search history, more disturbingly, at 12:11 p.m., Mark Bridger had looked at a cartoon image from his collection of pictures, showing young girls being sexually abused. One showed a girl bound with gaffer tape being raped by an adult. When his vehicle was recovered later, there was a roll of gaffer tape on his dashboard. The police now had a much more complete picture of what they believed had happened to April. When he abducted her, he wasn't aware that another child had witnessed it. At 8:30 p.m. that night, his Land Rover was spotted arriving at his home in a village 3 miles from where April had lived. Police did not know if this was the first time he'd been home since abducting April, or if he'd driven there directly after abducting her, killed her there, and then went out again to dispose of her body. This sighting may have not been the first time he returned home that day. The next day, shortly before 9 a.m., Bridger was spotted close to a riverbank carrying a black bin bag. A witness would later tell police she thought there was something in the bag. Later, he took his Land Rover into a garage to be repaired and pretended to help look for April before being arrested soon after. Fast-track DNA testing established that April's blood had been found at Mount Pleasant, most significantly on the underside of the carpet in the living room and in front of the wood burner. Police believe he probably sexually assaulted April before brutally murdering her and dismembering her body, disposing of her at various locations. As Mark Bridger had worked as a slaughterman in an abattoir, one theory was that he had used the skills he had gained there to dismember April's body after killing her. Bridger was due before the magistrates in Aberystwyth on the following Monday. The police said they remained focused and committed to finding April, adding that 10 specialist teams had been conducting a systematic and methodical search from daybreak on Saturday. Mark Bridger appeared at Aberystwyth Magistrates Court. A small crowd waited outside and one man threw a bottle at the van that had transported him to court, while others shouted abuse. Bridger was later driven away to HMP Manchester, formerly known as Strangeways. 6 months after April went missing, her family marked what would have been her 6th birthday by releasing pink balloons from the Brynagog Green, where she used to play. On Monday, the 14th of January 2013, it was time for Mark Bridger to enter his plea. He pled not guilty to abduction, murder, and concealing, disposing of, or destroying April's body. But it emerged that his case was that he was probably responsible for her death. April's parents saw Bridger in person for the first time since he had abducted their daughter. Coral and Paul would go to every day of the trial, determined to see this awful ordeal through to its conclusion. In March 2013, it was reported by the BBC that the search for April's body was set to end in the coming weeks. Although they hadn't recovered her body, the police and Crown Prosecution Service worked together to push on and prepare their case for trial. The trial was initially arranged for 2 months after the point of charge, giving officers and prosecutors an incredibly tight timeline to try and pull together all their arguments and evidence. When his trial began on April 29th, Mark Bridger continued the same story he had tried to spin in his interviews. He was in denial about his actions and tried to present himself as a caring individual who had tried to help April after the tragic accident he was adamant had occurred. The testimony of April's friend who had witnessed the abduction was to be crucial in countering his story. She said that April had got into the front and then clambered into the back. It just drove off. I didn't know she was going to go in the van. The girl fiddled with her hair and sometimes hugged her bear as she was questioned by Bridges barrister Brendan Kelly QC. Kelly, who like all court officials was not wearing a wig or gown, asked if she had a good view of the Land Rover. Yes, I did, she replied. Are you sure that you saw April talking to the man? Yes, I'm sure, she answered. It also emerged that Bridger had taken his Land Rover to a garage at 9 a.m. the day after April disappeared, saying he had been in an accident. A member of staff told the court that while everybody locally had been upset about April's disappearance, they found it odd that he was so upset by it all, and that he looked on the verge of crying as he spoke about it. The mechanic said he kept asking how much his vehicle would cost to repair and when he could have it back. He said he appeared nervous and edgy. Another person who had joined the search for April traveled through the village where Bridger was living. She said she had seen him in a lay-by carrying what looked like a black bin liner in his hand. The lay-by was close to the river and less than half a mile from his house, and the evidence just continued to mount. When he spoke to a postman about April, he feigned shock and asked what sort of vehicle the police were looking for, but he managed to contradict himself later when he joined a search party at about 2 p.m., first telling one volunteer he had found out at 9:30 that morning, then telling another he had been searching throughout the night. April's head teacher provided an insight into the relationships he had formed when she gave evidence at his trial. She told the court how he had a history of relationships with young mothers, and there were complex relationships between a number of these families. She had spoken to Bridger at a parents' evening just a couple of hours before he had taken April, when she had seen him talking to a former pupil now in secondary school, which she found strange. April's father also gave evidence as he had known Bridger since the early 1990s when the pair had dated sisters. He remembered Bridger as being a risk-taker who drove like a maniac. He spoke of how he had loaned Bridger a book on SAS survival skills, which he would not return, claiming to have lost it. Paul said he later found it during a visit to Bridger's house and took it back. As Bridger's behavior in the hours before April's abduction had become more predatory, the court heard how he had made an approach to a 10-year-old girl playing near to where April had last been seen. He invited her to a sleepover with his daughter, but no arrangements were finalized. During the police interviews, Bridger maintained that April had not been to his house, but when confronted in court by the overwhelming forensic evidence, he told the jury that images of her laying down in front of the fire had come to him in his dreams. After all the evidence had been presented, it was time for the jury to retire to consider their verdict, and on the 30th of May, they had come to a conclusion. Mark Bridger was found unanimously guilty on all 3 counts. He was sentenced to life in prison with a whole life order. He looked down at the floor as his sentence was handed out and said nothing. Despite knowing he will never be a free man again, he has refused to disclose exactly what happened to April that night, or where her body is, and no more remains of April Jones have ever been found. Many believe that this is the last piece of control he is not willing to relinquish. At the conclusion of his trial, Mark Bridger was described as a pathological and glib liar, a pedophile who harbored sexual and morbid fantasies about young girls. He chose to put witnesses through the ordeal of giving evidence over a lengthy trial that had lasted 4.5 weeks. He could have avoided all of it by pleading guilty in the first instance to the charges that had been leveled against him. Detective Superintendent Andrew John, who had led the investigation, said, in July 2013, it was reported by the 2013, the family had a burial funeral with many turning up to pay their respects. As they didn't have a body, the family buried an empty casket pulled on a horse-drawn carriage, with the burial site being the graveyard just yards away from where she had disappeared. They were given ash and bone fragments from the police to bury, and the family also buried personal items alongside. This gave the family a spot they could visit to remember April and be together as a family. In December 2013, the judicial office said that Mark Bridger had lodged an application for permission to appeal. But the following month they confirmed that he had abandoned his attempt just 11 days before the hearing was due to take place. In November 2018, leading search engine companies announced they were going to make it harder to find child abuse images online. As many as 100,000 search terms would now return no results that find illegal material. Following the horrors that had occurred at Mount Pleasant, the property was later demolished. April's family were there to watch the demolition. Tragically, April's father Paul developed a rare brain disease. The family revealed in February 2018 that the diagnosis had left him unable to remember the murder. His wife Coral told the Mirror that Paul could not understand why April hadn't visited him in hospital. Her family are adamant that she will be remembered for the joy and happiness she brought to so many people and not for the tragic way that she left this earth. On May 6, 1988, the typically sunny spring day in Mount Vernon, Illinois took a tragic turn for 22-year-old nurse Jana Reynolds. Despite the pleasant spring air flowing through the neighborhood, Jana's lifeless body was discovered within the confines of her own home. Despite the tireless efforts of the police, the identity of the perpetrator remained a mystery, leading to a decade-long search for answers. Finally, investigators achieved a breakthrough, uncovering the truth behind the question: who was responsible for the murder of Jana Reynolds? This case brings us to Mount Vernon, a city and the county seat of Jefferson County, Illinois in the United States. Established in 1817 by Zadok Casey, this place is renowned as the Festival Art City or the King City and has been home to over 35,000 residents as of 2021. Notable attractions in the area include Cedar Center for the Arts and Jefferson County Historical Museum and Village. However, despite its charm, Mount Vernon faces significant crime challenges with a higher rate of violent crime compared to the national average. The city has implemented measures to combat this issue, such as increased police presence and community policing programs. Against this backdrop, the tragic fate of Jana Reynolds unfolds. Born on January 15, 1966, Jana was the daughter of Robert and Marilyn Jane Wellmaker and had an older brother named Alex Wellmaker. In 1987, she married her high school sweetheart, Jeff Reynolds. Jana worked as a nurse at Mount Vernon Good Samaritan Hospital while pursuing her associate degree in nursing, with only one more year remaining until her graduation in 1988. In the meantime, Jana's spouse was employed at a nearby printing company. She was renowned for leading a respectable and ordinary life, and she was well liked by those who were acquainted with her. The investigation into Jana's demise left the entire community feeling upset and bewildered. People yearned to uncover the truth and sought justice. Even amidst the sorrow, the community made a pledge to remember Jana for the remarkable individual she was, to preserve her memory in Mount Vernon. On May 6, 1988, Jeff Reynolds worked the night shift. Upon returning home the following morning, he stumbled upon something that would forever alter his existence. Upon reaching his residence, he noticed that Jana's vehicle was still parked in the carport, which was unusual. Typically, when Jeff returned from work, Jana would have already departed for school, so he entered the house wondering why she hadn't gone. The first indication that something was amiss was the broken back door as he ventured inside. Upon entering the bedroom, he discovered 22-year-old Jana lying on the bed, drenched in blood. The sight that Jeff encountered was horrifying. She had been repeatedly stabbed, her throat slashed multiple times, her right hand nearly severed, and it appeared that she had also been sexually assaulted. Overwhelmed by what he had witnessed, he immediately dialed 911, reporting that his wife had been murdered. A police officer from the Mount Vernon Police Department received the distress call from Jeff. He arrived at the crime scene a few minutes later and commenced investigating for any potential leads. After some time, the medical examiner determined that Jana was likely killed between 12 p.m. and 3 a.m. Upon promptly arriving at the scene, officers discovered Jana's lifeless body. She was wearing thermal pajama bottoms while lying on the bed, but her underwear was pulled down, hanging on her leg. Her wrist was injured and lacerated to the point where it was almost detached from her arm, and her throat had also been slit. Typically, in cases of murder, the spouse is often a primary suspect. However, in the case of Jana Reynolds, circumstances took an unexpected turn. Jeff had a strong alibi. He was present at his workplace throughout the entire incident. As a result, he was eliminated as a suspect and the investigators redirected their attention towards other individuals. When the police conducted inquiries in the neighborhood, they took notice of Albert McDaniels, who was walking on the street during the presumed time of the murder. McDaniels informed the investigators that he had no knowledge of anything unusual and had not witnessed anything out of the ordinary. The police obtained samples of his blood, pubic hair, and saliva for a DNA test. After analyzing the samples, the results came back negative, leading them to exclude Albert as a potential perpetrator of the crime. Samples were collected from various suspects, including Joe Tucker, another man who had been seen in the vicinity that night. Tucker willingly provided a sample of his head hair, but no further samples were taken. The hair sample did not match the fragment discovered at the crime scene. However, the pathologist stressed that ruling out the suspect would necessitate pubic hair samples. Despite pursuing over 300 leads, the investigation into Jana's murder eventually reached a dead end. The killer had vanished without leaving a trace. Mount Vernon officers meticulously searched the neighborhood, hoping to uncover any clues related to the perpetrator. They combed through the streets, checked the alleys, and meticulously examined trash cans, searching for anything that could be linked to the crime. Unfortunately, the neighborhood search yielded no leads. By the end of 1988, the detectives were unable to press charges against anyone for the crime, and the case remained unsolved and forgotten. They carefully preserved all the collected evidence, holding on to the hope that advancements in technology would one day provide new avenues for testing and analysis. Tragically, Jana Reynolds' case remained unsolved for 13 years after her murder. In August 2001, Detective McElroy from the Mount Vernon Police Department began reviewing the physical evidence gathered during the investigation. He foresaw that advancements in forensic science and technology could potentially yield new leads, prompting him to reopen the case. Utilizing a cutting-edge tool known as the alternative light source, investigators were able to identify various stains on Jana's clothing, ranging from biological fluids to fibers and trace materials, by utilizing different wavelengths of light. Upon examining Jana's pajama pants and underwear, they discovered stains that were confirmed to be seminal fluid, providing stronger DNA evidence compared to what they had 13 years ago. In total, they found 23 different stains on Jana's pajamas that could potentially contain DNA, prompting them to send the clothing to the private laboratory, Cellmark, for further analysis. Initially, a preliminary test was conducted to confirm that the stains were indeed semen, which proved to be accurate. Approximately 2 weeks later, investigators were able to develop a profile of the individual responsible for leaving the stains on Jana's pajamas bottoms. Their hope was to finally solve the enduring mystery that had plagued them for so long. In 2002, detectives had utilized advanced forensic technology to examine Jana's dress. which enabled them to establish a DNA profile of a male whose bodily fluids were present on the garment. Detective McElroy revisited the old cases and noticed a connection between the assault on Jana Reynolds and another similar case. Taking a chance, he requested the crime lab to compare evidence from Joe Tucker with evidence from the assault case as well as the unknown profile in the Reynolds case. Surprisingly, it was discovered that one suspect matched in both cases, and that suspect was identified as Joe Tucker. Detective McElroy informed Jana's husband, Jeff, that they were preparing to apprehend the suspect. Joe Tucker, born on February 9, 1964, had a history of criminal activities dating back to 1988. He had previously encountered legal issues in Illinois and was currently employed in Missouri. In September of 1988, Joe was sentenced to 2 years in prison for drug charges. 2 years later, in 1990, he found himself back behind bars, this time for a 3-year sentence due to theft. In 1996, Joe returned to prison once again, receiving a 4-year sentence for burglary and an additional 4 years for drug-related offenses. After a brief period of parole, he was incarcerated again in 1998, this time with a 6-year sentence for burglary and a 5-year sentence for aggravated battery. Joe regained his freedom in 2002, but his liberty was short-lived as he was later apprehended for the murder of Jana Reynolds. In May 2002, while residing in Springfield, Missouri, Tucker's DNA was linked to stains found on Jana's pajamas. The police had to travel to Springfield to locate Joe Tucker, and finally, in 2002, he was arrested for the murder of Jana Reynolds. Throughout the interrogation process, Joe vehemently denied any involvement in Jana's murder. He maintained his innocence, although he acknowledged knowing Jana as they had worked together at a restaurant in the early 1980s, insisted that he had never been to Jana Reynolds' home in 1988, but the DNA report contradicted his claims, providing substantial evidence against him. While awaiting trial, Joe was sent to Menard Prison due to parole violations. It was during his time in jail that he confided in another inmate named Robin Gecht, unknowingly revealing all the details about the case. Little did Joe know that Gecht was known as a jailhouse lawyer. In 2002, the state's attorney contacted the police investigators, informing them that they had received a letter from a prisoner named Robin Gecht. Acting on this information, Detective McElroy interviewed Gecht regarding the matter and Gecht presented the letters. In one of the letters, Gecht claimed to possess information about Jana's death. Investigators proceeded to interview Gecht, who stated that the defendant had approached him seeking assistance in preparing a defense for his case. During the court proceedings, Gecht testified that Tucker had confessed to breaking into the house with the intention of burglary and assault on his victim on May 6th. He also admitted to killing Jana. When questioned, Tucker admitted to going to Jana's house with his friend Albert McDaniels on the night of May 5, 1988. Joe introduced them and then left to be alone with Jana. Tucker claimed that McDaniels entered the room and wanted to have a physical relationship with her. When she refused, McDaniels allegedly killed her. Tucker stated that he didn't speak up earlier because McDaniels had threatened him. However, the fact that the back door of the house was forcefully broken contradicts the idea that Jana willingly let them in. All of Tucker's statements were fabricated to protect himself. On April 11, 2006, a jury found Joe Tucker guilty of murdering Jana Reynolds after deliberating for less than 4 hours. The jury concluded that the crime was exceptionally cruel and heinous. Tucker was convicted of 10 counts of first-degree murder on June 28, 2006, and was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Currently, 59-year-old Joe Tucker is serving his sentence at Western Illinois Correctional Center. Following the trial's conclusion on June 28, 2006, the court denied the defendant's post-trial motion. Joe Tucker was indicted by a grand jury on 10 counts of first-degree murder and assault. In 1979, what was supposed to be a fun day at the pool for a 12-year-old girl turned into a painful murder investigation spanning over 4 decades. And this is the oldest cold case finally solved in 2022, the Alicia Michelle Jackson case. Justice has finally been served for this young girl's death by the help of more modern investigative techniques, the unrelenting support of her family, and enough dogged determination displayed by the police force to move mountains. So stay tuned to learn all the details. Con Road, Texas is where we begin Laisha's story. It is located in Montgomery County, Texas, just around a 40-mile shy of Houston. It's a quaint small town with a lot of charm. This was home to Laisha Jackson, along with her mother, Laura Kay, stepfather, Charles Hirsch, stepbrother Kirk Hirsch, and 2 biological brothers named Sean and Larry. She was a thriving student attending Washington Junior High, She had blonde hair and was known for wearing her light blue rimmed glasses, which were her trademark. September 7th, 1979 was a warm, beautiful day. Wildwood Lake and its nearby swimming pool area were common hangout spots for families, kids, and teens. On this particular day, 12-year-old Laisha, as well as her two older brothers, Sean and Larry, were headed there to cool off and hang out. Their cousins and a few close friends also joined them on their fun in the sun excursion. In the 1970s, thoughts on day-to-day safety were very different than they are now. Back then, it was normal for children to walk places alone or with friends, to hitchhike with strangers or to visit others' homes unsupervised. Mobile phones were not around yet, so add on the additional hurdle of not having constant contact. The group had a wonderful day swimming and goofing off until before they knew it. Sunset was fast approaching at about 7 p.m. Not wanting to miss curfew or to be late for dinner, everyone decided to wrap things up and began to head home. Laisha, however, was having too much fun and didn't want to go home yet. Her two brothers, Sean and Larry, knew that the swimming area was generally known to be safe by the community, so they began to trek home without their sister. The trio's mother, Laura Kay, noticed that only the boys walked through the front door and promptly asked them where their sister was. They told her that they assumed that she would follow close behind them and be home within the hour. This understandably left a bad taste in Laura's mouth, as it would for any concerned parent. After a short while with no sign of Laisha's return home, her stepfather, Charles Hirsch, decided to take action. He was worried, but not yet concerned, that she might be in any danger. He walked over to the swimming pool area to find her and tell her to come home. But the longer he looked, the sooner he realized that there was no sign of his daughter. Parental adrenaline kicked in for Charles and Laura, and they took the initial search efforts into their own hands. They drove the streets of the subdivision where the swimming area was located and kept their eyes out for their daughter. When that search came up short, they took the next step of stopping by the houses of family and friends to ask if anyone had seen or heard from her, particularly the ones that had been with her earlier that day. Once they found that she was no longer with any of them either, the realization washed over them. Their daughter was missing. Laisha Jackson was reported missing to the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office. Sheriff's Deputy L.B. Robinson was quickly assigned to the case given the urgency of a missing child. A boy by the name of Bobby Hill was one of the first people to be interviewed by the detective. He was a friend of Laisha's who was the last to have seen her. He claimed that before the group left without her, he had last seen Laisha sitting on the pier wearing a pink swimsuit with either a white or yellow shirt and blue shorts with red trim on top of it. He also recalled that while walking home from the lake, he and his friends noticed a brown Monte Carlo passed by them several times, driving erratically on the road and nearly hitting them. This suspicious incident set off alarm bells for Detective Robinson. After questioning Laisha's brothers, cousins, and other friends and family, they headed down to the swimming area to search for any clues as to her whereabouts. The search came up short, and they soon made the understandable assumption that she may very well have been abducted by the man driving the brown car. Then and there, the detective called headquarters for additional backup, as this now might be upgraded to an abduction case. As word spread of Laisha's disappearance around the small town, the police force soon realized how loved this girl was. As many community members, alongside the family, and nearly 24 volunteers from the local fire department helped join the search. The group searched far and wide until 12 a.m. that night, still finding virtually no trace of Laisha in or around town. The next day, as the hunt continued, the Sheriff's Marine Division came forward, wanting to make sure they covered all investigative bases before assuming that Laisha had been abducted. For one, it was possible that she could have drowned in the swimming area. The kids were all there unsupervised. They conducted a thorough search of the swimming area, lake, pier, and woods, and still no sign of Laisha. Kirk Hirsch, Laisha's older stepbrother, was the first one to come across a clue. Looking for his sister, he was combing the corner of Creekwood Street and Deep Forest Drive, 2 blocks away from where Laisha was last seen, when he found something lying in the road, a pair of black, thick, rimmed glasses. They were damaged, comparable to damage a pair of glasses would receive if they were hit by a vehicle. Kirk and his family knew that they belonged to Laisha. The family sought help from the family optometrist that prescribed her glasses, and they later positively identified the pair as having belonged to Laisha. This was blood-chilling news for the family. They now had to prepare for the outcome that they most feared. September 13th, a little less than a week after Laisha went missing, an Exxon Gas Company employee by the name of James Wiley Dawson was out on a special assignment and had been sent out to fix a pipeline problem along Exxon Road. This road was just about a half-mile away from the lake. As soon as he arrived, he noted the overwhelming smell of decomposition in the air, but his mind went to it being that of just a dead animal. The smell proved to be too distracting, and he prioritized finding the dead animal. However, instead of a dead animal, James Dawson stumbled upon what looked to be a nude, heavily decomposed body of a girl. He immediately called the city police, and detectives rushed to the scene. Texas is notoriously scorching hot and humid at that time of year, so the body was in advanced stages of decomposition. They had to act fast to collect evidence. Officers knew that this could very well be the body of Laisha, but they had to be sure. They secured the crime scene and collected all available evidence from the body and nearby area, including the tracks found around the site. As the investigation continued at the crime scene, everyone soon got the news that they had been dreading. Near the body, clothes matching the description of the alleged outfit that the young girl was last seen in were found scattered near her nude body. It was then and later through DNA testing that they confirmed the remains to be of Laisha Michelle Jackson. This was a devastating find for the police, but of course more notably for her heartbroken family and friends. The later autopsy revealed that Laisha had met a brutal end. She showed signs of sexual assault as semen samples were found on her shirt. Signs of strangulation were also found, which was revealed to be her eventual cause of death. While her signature blue glasses were of course not with her, her favorite gold butterfly necklace was still around her neck when she died. Laisha Marie Jackson was soon laid to rest in a private ceremony by her family and friends. Her mourning family soon moved away from Conroe, even leaving Montgomery County altogether, as the memories of their lost loved one proved to be too painful to relive every day. After their departure, the abduction and murder case remained open. Police were determined to bring Laisha and her family justice. A phone line for tips was opened, and police encouraged anyone with information that might be helpful to the case to call it in. One tip was especially interesting to police. It involved a man, a Vietnam veteran, and a known heroin addict. When questioned, the tipster confirmed that many who knew this man witnessed him give intimate details of the crime to others, details that could not have been known to the public. He also apparently often asked his friends to set him up with local girls. Shockingly, he did not mean grown women around his age, but rather young girls. Police were on high alert. Using the information given by the tipster, they eventually got their hands on this man and arrested him on suspicion of murder. They used typical police techniques of interrogation until he broke. He confessed to the crime, but there was a twist. He claimed that he had an accomplice who aided him in the murder of Laisha Jackson. The man gave information about his accomplice to police, and before long both men were in custody and undergoing intense questioning. Police obtained search warrants for both of their homes and conducted thorough searches where they found red fibers. These fibers were similar to those found on Laisha's shorts on the day that she was killed. This was the physical evidence that police needed to nab these two on the charges of murder, especially since they already had a signed written confession given by the Vietnam veteran suspect. However, yet another twist was to come. After the red fibers were found in their homes, the suspect who signed the confession claimed that police had coerced the written confession from him. He went on to further claim police brutality while he was in jail awaiting questioning. These claims were taken seriously, as even people under arrest have legal rights, and soon the FBI stepped in to perform a more thorough investigation. Officers adamantly denied the claims of police brutality and coercion, but it proved to be too late, as a court case was already in the works. Unfortunately, due to the claims in the court case to follow, all evidence found by investigators such as the written confession and red fibers could no longer be upheld in court. This rendered the very damning evidence useless. In the end, the judge also ruled that the charge of murder was to be dropped for both suspects. These two men were released without so much as a warning, which was once again a devastating blow to Laisha's family and the investigators. They were now back to the drawing board, and as years and decades went by, the case got colder and colder. Decades later, in the year 2006, a man by the name of Tommy Deroy joined the police force in Texas, eventually earning the title of detective on the cold case squad. Deroy was actually a former schoolmate of Laisha's, and although he claims to not have known her personally, the case was to home for him, and he yearned to give the Jackson family closure after all this time and mourning. Alongside another cold case investigator on the force named Detective Terrence Greenwood, the work and diving back into this case began. Tommy Deroy knew that some 40 years had passed since the murder. DNA technology had improved greatly since the original investigation, which meant there was better hope for the matching of a suspect. Perhaps it was the two men that his predecessors let slip away all those years ago. Deroy sent the semen and other samples found on Leisha's clothing back in for DNA testing. His hopes were crushed as the samples still could not be matched to any known criminals already listed on the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, also known as CODIS. The samples were decades old and not able to be processed to the fullest extent any longer. Witnesses from that day in September 1979 had moved on, passed away, or forgotten the details of that fateful day. Leisha's family had already moved far away from Texas at this point in an attempt to move on. All of this meant that they had to find other key evidence to solve this crime all on their own. The clock had been ticking for far too long and hope was dwindling. Recently in 2018, Courtney Fisher, a reporter with ABC 13, re-sparked public interest in the cold case of Leisha Jackson. Her report reminded cold case investigators that times have changed and that newer forensic DNA techniques were now available and were helping solve crimes left and right. In 2022, the police took her advice. There is a modern technology that goes by the name of MVAC. This method describes a process in which DNA-free buffers are sprayed directly onto surfaces that are being tested, followed by vacuum pressure then being applied in order to collect the best possible DNA sample. This technology is a major breakthrough and can collect far better samples than the ones collected by typical swabbing. Everyone's fingers were crossed that this could be the turning point in the case. In October of 2021, the MVAC method was put to the test by the Montgomery County Cold Case Homicide Squad, retesting DNA found on Leisha's shirt from 1979. And just like that, 43 years after the murder, a DNA match for the killer was found. The DNA sample was entered into the FBI's CODIS system, and finally it came back as a 100% match to a man named Gerald Dwight Casey. Detectives made yet another shocking discovery at this time, as it turns out that this man was well known by police already. Casey was a known felon who had many convictions for burglary, assault on a police officer, possession of heroin and marijuana. Shockingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, Gerald Dwight Casey had also already been convicted of capital murder once before. He was convicted in 1991 for a murder committed in 1989, 10 years after he had murdered Leisha Jackson. He had been executed by lethal injection in Texas on April 18, 2002 at 47 years old. To confirm his guilt, investigators compared the DNA found on Leisha's shirt to a blood sample taken from Casey prior to his state execution. And the 100% match was confirmed yet again. This man was Leisha's killer. As he exited death row after his long stint in prison and headed for the lethal injection chamber, Casey declined to share any last words. He apparently was unremorseful, and no one knew at the time what other atrocities he had committed before he died. Gerald Dwight Casey did not survive to receive proper punishment for what he did to Leisha Michelle Jackson. But at least he had been punished and is no longer able to hurt anyone else. While discovering who killed Leisha was a momentous occasion, it of course remained bittersweet news for Leisha's family and friends. They thanked the police force for never giving up on her, but often declined to speak publicly about the case any longer, since they had made peace with the outcome. They remain mostly anonymous to this day. The Montgomery County Sheriff's Office had now solved and closed its oldest cold case in the county. Modern advancements in DNA research, persistent detective work, and decades of hope solved this case. Justice was served cold, and it was served for a different murder. Whether you believe in karma, fate, an afterlife, or a spiritual deity, it is safe to say that one can hope that Gerald Casey is receiving his cosmic punishment wherever he is now, and that Leisha Jackson can finally rest peacefully. And there are all of the details. While this murderer went to his grave with the secret that he had assaulted and murdered an innocent 12-year-old girl, justice still prevailed. Advancements in forensic technology will mean that more and more killers will be brought to justice. On the winter day of February 19, 1982, at approximately 5 p.m., law enforcement officers promptly responded to a distress call from a concerned neighbor regarding the Krausneck residence at 33 Del Rio Drive in Brighton, New York. Upon entering the master bedroom of the family's home, the officers were confronted with a horrifying sight. Kathy Krausneck, tragically struck with a single blow to the head by an axe, was discovered lifeless on her bed. The circumstances surrounding this brutal act of violence raise questions as to the motive behind the killing. Was the perpetrator someone known to Kathy? Or was it an unfortunate incident stemming from a random robbery gone awry? Today's narrative unfolds in the serene town of Brighton, New York, situated in Monroe County, near the southeastern border of Rochester. This charming suburban community has its own unique character and is cherished by its residents. To delve into Kathy Krausneck's background, She was born as Kathleen Schlosser in Mount Clemens, Michigan in 1952. Growing up in a modest working-class family, Kathy was one of 7 siblings. Known for her vibrant personality and blonde locks, she was well-liked during her time at a Michigan high school. It was during this period that she crossed paths with James Krausenk, a reserved, amiable, and athletic young man hailing from a prominent local family. Although only a year older than Kathy, their connection blossomed not only in high school, but also during their shared educational journey at Western Michigan University. Despite their contrasting natures and differing family backgrounds, love prevailed, and the couple embarked on a lifelong journey together. In May 1974, Kathy and James exchanged vows in a church ceremony in Mount Clemens. The following year, armed with her bachelor's degree and James with his newly acquired master's degree, they relocated to Fort Collins, Colorado. It was there that James pursued his PhD studies at Colorado State University. While Kathy experienced the heartache of a miscarriage shortly after their move, she later gave birth to their beloved daughter, Sarah, a few years down the road. James successfully completed his doctoral dissertation and commenced his teaching career at Lynchburg College in Virginia. Despite being referred to as Dr. Krausenk at Lynchburg, it is worth noting that he had not officially received his doctoral degree. His thesis was sent back for revisions and James neglected to resubmit his work. Kathy encouraged him to seek a more profitable career path to provide a better life for their family, but he hesitated, likely due to his lack of necessary qualifications. Despite his desperate attempts to secure a raise, his request was denied. Eventually, he accepted a position as an economist at Kodak, joining the Kodak family of 60,000 employees. With his new high-paying job and financial assistance from his parents, the Krauseneks purchased a new home on Del Rio Drive in the Rochester suburb of Brighton, New York, close to the Kodak headquarters. After settling into their new residence, Kathy enrolled Sarah in Queen of Peace Nursery School nearby and made some friends. She also signed Sarah up for dance classes. Despite feeling somewhat isolated during James' long work hours and Sarah's activities, Kathy never voiced any complaints. By early 1982, they seemed to be living the American dream. They had a charming 3-year-old daughter, a well-kept suburban home, and James' new lucrative economist position at Eastman Kodak. However, trouble was brewing. Kodak officials were doubtful of James' PhD as he delayed providing proof of his degree. This, along with work stress, caused him to become distant from his family. Kathy confided in friends that he often returned home from work in a bad mood. The couple had been experiencing difficulties for some time. Kathy was reportedly upset because he had lied about completing his PhD, causing strain in their relationship. She even mentioned the possibility of taking Sarah and returning to their hometown. Despite this, there were no reports of domestic violence. Unfortunately, tragedy would soon strike the Krausenk family. Upon the morning of February 19, 1982, merely 6 months subsequent to relocating to their new residence, officers from the Brighton Police Department were summoned to a 911 call. James Krausenk arrived back home from his workplace to discover his 29-year-old wife, Kathy's lifeless body, nestled in bed in an upstairs bedroom with their 3.5-year-old daughter, Sarah, gazing out of the window. Upon entering the residence, the officers encountered a horrific crime scene in the master bedroom. Kathy was found lying in a pool of blood in her own bed with a long-handled axe lodged in her skull. The murder weapon was retrieved from the couple's unlocked garage. Sarah had been at home with her mother all day, but remained unharmed. When questioned about his whereabouts that day, James stated that his wife and daughter were sound asleep when he departed for work at approximately 6:30 a.m. that morning. He mentioned returning home at 5 p.m. Before discovering his wife's body, James recounted grabbing his daughter and fleeing the house, seeking help from a neighbor. When questioned, young Sarah mentioned seeing a malevolent figure, but her father prevented further communication with the investigators. The crime scene did not yield many clues. Although signs of a burglary were evident, investigators sensed that something was amiss. Broken window was discovered, along with silver and jewelry neatly arranged both upstairs and downstairs, as if deliberately left behind by the intruder. In the dining room, 2 candelabra and a silver tea set were found upright near a plastic bag. A screwdriver was located on the stairs. Kathy's purse was scattered in the dining room. The family dog had been confined to the basement. Interestingly, no items were reported stolen, leading investigators to suspect that the burglary was staged. The medical examiner determined that Kathy's demise resulted from a single axe blow to the head and brain while she was asleep. The handle of the axe had been meticulously cleaned, leaving no trace of fingerprints or DNA. The time of death was narrowed down to a 2-hour window between 6:55 a.m. and 8:55 a.m., which effectively eliminated Kathy's husband James as a suspect. This chilling case quickly gained notoriety in the media and became known as the infamous Brighton Axe murder. During the initial investigation, one of the suspects considered by the investigators was Ed Larrabee, a convicted killer and sex offender who happened to live near the couple's residence at the time. Interestingly, in 2014, while serving time for an unrelated murder, Larrabee shockingly confessed to killing Kathy Krausnick. However, his confession didn't align with the evidence. Larrabee claimed the murder took place during the summer of 1981, when in reality it occurred in the winter of 1982. It turned out that Larrabee had a reputation for falsely confessing to crimes he hadn't committed, seeking attention and notoriety. Some of the victims he claimed to have murdered were actually alive and well. The investigators faced a daunting challenge as they lacked substantial physical or circumstantial evidence to connect anyone to the crime. Despite their tireless efforts, the Brighton Axe murder remained an unsolved mystery for many years, haunting the community and leaving Kathy's family desperate for answers. In a shocking turn of events, just a day after Kathy's tragic passing, James abruptly returned to Mount Clemens with their daughter Sarah, without even notifying Kathy's grieving family. This sudden disappearance severed all contact between Sarah and her maternal relatives, leaving them heartbroken and bewildered. 4 years later, in 1986, James remarried. However, the marriage was short-lived, lasting only 9 months. While James claimed that he remarried to provide Sarah with a mother figure, his second wife believed that he ended the union due to a growing bond between her and Sarah. As the 1990s unfolded, James went on to marry 2 more times. He relocated to Washington and found success in his career, climbing the corporate ladder at a subsidiary of Weyerhaeuser. His professional journey took him to California and Georgia before he ultimately achieved the position of vice president of sales at the company's headquarters in Washington. Despite his tumultuous personal life, James seemed to have found stability and happiness with his 4th wife, Sharon. They enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle, seemingly leaving behind the shadows of the past. They purchased a beautiful 4-bedroom French country house in Gig Harbor near Tacoma. However, life took a different turn for Sarah as she moved to Texas and started her own family. Despite the distance, she remained closely connected with her father and stepmother. As the years went by, the case seemed to have hit a dead end until District Attorney Sandra Dorley and her team decided to dig deeper in 2015. They tirelessly searched for any evidence that might have been overlooked before. Among the discoveries was a delicate blue fiber made of glass, which originated from a shattered window in the house. Dorley attempted to match it with a previously untested blue knee sock found at the scene. Despite extensive testing, no DNA from an external source was found, effectively eliminating the possibility of an outside killer. The focus then shifted to Kathy's husband James as the prime suspect. However, charging him solely based on circumstantial evidence was not an option, and there was another obstacle to overcome. The timeline of Kathy's death placed James outside of the house at the time of the murder, seemingly ruling him out as a suspect. Nevertheless, Dorley and her team were determined not to let him off the hook so easily. They sought the expertise of renowned forensic pathologist, Dr. Michael Baden, who had played a crucial role in numerous high-profile cases. After thoroughly examining all the relevant documents, including police reports, autopsy reports, photographs, and other evidence, Baden reached a significant conclusion. Contrary to the original medical examiner's findings, he believed that Kathy had died before James left for work that morning. Baden pointed out that the partially digested food in her stomach and the stage of rigor mortis her body was in indicated an earlier time of death. The initial examiner had observed rigor mortis setting in the evening of the crime, but Baden explained that it takes at least 12 hours for a body to reach that level of rigor mortis. Therefore, he concluded that the murder must have occurred between 9 p.m. the previous evening and 3 or 4 a.m. on the morning of the crime. In 2019, James Krausnick was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife based on Dr. Baden's analysis and other evidence. His trial commenced in August 2022. The defense argued that the evidence was circumstantial and suggested that Larrabee, who had already passed away, could have been responsible for Kathy's death. However, the prosecutors contended that there was no evidence of an intruder. The robbery was staged, and James was the only plausible suspect, especially considering their young daughter remained unharmed despite being present at the scene. Ultimately, the jury sided with the prosecution, leading to James Krausnick's conviction for second-degree murder. Despite this, his daughter Sarah, who is now 41 years old, continues to support her father. and does not believe he had any involvement in her mother's. Conversely, after enduring 40 years of grief, Kathy's family finds solace in the fact that justice has finally been served. Annette Schlosser, Kathy's sister, shared with Spectrum News that their mother passed away without ever knowing who took her daughter's life, describing their experience as living in a state of torment. Annette firmly believes that no one could commit such a heinous act against her sister. However, Kathy's 95-year-old father was present in court to witness James being held accountable for his daughter's horrific murder. Now, the Schlosser family's sole desire is to reconnect with Kathy's daughter, as they have had no contact with her for several years. They express their hope that they can all find healing together after enduring this tragic incident. James Krausenk was eventually sentenced to 25 years to prison by a judge. However, 6 months later, he died in his cell. Springfield, Oregon is a charming town tucked away in the breathtaking landscapes of the Pacific Northwest. Just a stone's throw from Eugene, Springfield has carved out its own identity by becoming the beloved sister city that never quite outgrew its small-town charm. And here's an exciting tidbit. Legend has it that Springfield served as the inspiration for the iconic American town featured in The Simpsons. As you wander through the streets, you'll encounter the coolest murals splashed across various walls. Despite this colorful backdrop, the crime in Springfield today surpasses the national average. However, back in the 80s, the occurrence of violent crimes in this region was unheard of. Therefore, when a mother of her 3 children were attacked in this very place, people were left stunned. It still stands as one of the most unsettling tales to have ever unfolded within the city's borders. At approximately 10:48 p.m. on Thursday, May 19, 1983, 27-year-old Diane Downs arrived at the Mackenzie Willamette Hospital ER. The mother pointed towards her red Nissan sports car and screamed out loud, "Somebody shot my kids!" 8-year-old Christine and 3-year-old Danny were struggling to breathe as they lay in the backseat gasping for air. Meanwhile, 7-year-old Cheryl was lying face down on the floorboard in front, nearly hidden beneath the dashboard, covered by a dark sweater. In a race against time, all 3 children were rushed to the emergency room. The mother, Diane, had a minor gunshot wound to her left forearm, which was wrapped in a towel. A surprisingly minor injury, considering the viciousness of the attack. Her children, however, were in critical condition. They had been shot multiple times at close range. Dr. Stephen Wilhite, one of the few board-certified thoracic surgeons in the hospital that night, rushed to the hospital after hearing about the tragic incident. Christine bore the brunt of 3 gunshot wounds, with 2 striking her left chest and 1 affecting her thumb. Due to immense blood loss, she had suffered a stroke. Danny had suffered a gunshot wound to his spine, resulting in paralysis. Although barely, both of them managed to hold on to life. Unfortunately, that was not the case for the other sibling, Cheryl, who had sustained 2 gunshot wounds to her back and was pronounced dead later that night. When news of Cheryl's death reached Diane, her demeanor was calm. A little too calm. She did not even flinch after hearing that the other 2 children had survived after being grievously injured. Her sole inquiry was whether the bullet had missed Danny's heart. The lack of visible emotional response from Diane struck those around her as odd, to say the least. It was difficult for them to fathom how a mother who had just lost 1 child and found the other 2 in critical condition could appear so seemingly detached and unaffected. However, the medical professionals attending to her wounds speculated that Diane might be experiencing shock, a common response to such a distressing incident. Understanding the gravity of the situation, the hospital didn't waste any time in alerting the around 11:15 p.m. 3 officers from the Lane County Sheriff's Office, Dick Tracy, Doug Welch, and Roy Pond arrived at the hospital. Once Diane's initial treatment was complete, she was seated for an interview with the detectives. They began the interview with an introduction and then moved on to ask Diane about the events that had transpired throughout the day, seeking her first-hand account. Diane proceeded to tell the investigators that she left the kids at her parents' house at around 6:15 a.m. before heading off to work at approximately 6:30 a.m. Christy and Cheryl attended school, while Diane's mother looked after Danny. After school ended, the girls joined their younger brother at their grandparents' home. Diane said she got off work at around 3:30 p.m. and went to her parents' house to pick up the kids. She returned to their rental duplex at 1352 Q Street with her children to have supper. But then there would be an unusual change in their otherwise ordinary routine. Diane had a friend named Heather Pollard, who resided outside of Springfield on Sunderman Road. She explained that Heather had previously expressed an interest in owning a horse to her, so when Diane had come across an article about horses available for adoption, She thought Heather might find it appealing. Since the Pollard family did not have a phone, Diane, accompanied by her children, decided to pay them a visit that night. They stayed at the Pollard property approximately 15 to 20 minutes, during which Diane engaged in conversation with Heather while her kids had the opportunity to feed and interact with the horse on the farm. Diane said they left around 9:15 p.m. On their way back home, Cheryl occupied the front passenger seat, with Danny sitting directly behind her in the back seat, and Christy seated next to him, behind the passenger seat, instead of taking the direct route back home. Impulsively, Diane made a spur-of-the-moment decision to indulge in a bit of sightseeing, something she claimed both she and the children enjoyed doing. However, after doing this for a while, she turned back towards Springfield, noticing all three children had fallen asleep. She was driving down Old Mohawk Road, outside the city, and Duran Duran's Hungry Like a Wolf was playing on the stereo. Diane said she only drove for a short distance on that dark country road when she encountered a man in the middle of the road. Diane proceeded to tell the detectives that the man pushed her toward the back of the vehicle and then put his hand into the open car window. The next thing she heard was the loud popping sounds, which were directed toward Cheryl first, followed by Danny and finally Christy. He then turned to Diane and once again demanded the car. Diane further continued that she mustered up the courage to fight back, realizing that her children had been shot. After Diane managed to escape in her car, she noticed that her children were bleeding profusely. While Christy was choking on her own blood, Danny was moaning in pain, but Cheryl didn't make any noise the whole time. Diane said she drove as fast as she could, but her own gunshot wound was causing her pain. So at some point she tightly wrapped a towel from her wrist to her elbow to slow the flow of blood. Just like the hospital workers, the detectives couldn't help but notice Diane's seemingly detached demeanor throughout the interview. Despite the gravity of the situation and the tragic events that had unfolded, she didn't display the expected emotional response. Instead, she remained composed, not shedding a tear and even laughing at certain points. While it is true that shock and grief can manifest differently in individuals, the detectives sensed that something wasn't adding up. Diane even went on to say that she prayed for their deaths to spare them from the suffering. There were more red flags. Who goes sightseeing in the dark with 3 young children in the car? Why would someone stop the car and interact with a suspicious individual on a deserted road? And which mother would prioritize tending to her own wound with a towel while her kids were bleeding to death? The hospital workers also shared some of the disturbing comments made by Diane upon her arrival at the hospital. She reportedly made remarks such as, "Boy, this has really spoiled my vacation. And that really ruined my new car. I got blood all over the back of it." These comments were not only bizarre but also deeply troubling, making everyone question the credibility of her story. Despite this, the investigators wanted to give the benefit of the doubt to a grieving mother, so they did not yet rule out the possibility of an unknown perpetrator. Their attention shifted towards gathering more information about the perpetrator, whom Diane had described to them. The police swiftly issued an APB for the bushy-haired stranger, a term Diane had never used, but it summarized her description. Ironically, in law enforcement, the term bushy-haired stranger is used to refer to a person who does not exist and cannot be produced in a court of law. It serves as a cover-up alibi figure for the guilty party to falsely attribute their crimes to. Nonetheless, a composite sketch was made based on Diane's description and was widely circulated to the media. Unfortunately, no witnesses or individuals who had seen the alleged perpetrator or his vehicle came forward to provide significant leads or breakthroughs in the investigation. But as word went out about this horrific tragedy, residents of Springfield were left in a state of shock and fear. The idea that a violent and ruthless individual had targeted innocent children and their mother left people on edge. Children were no longer allowed to alone. Mothers in particular refrained from going out in the evening with their children. The safety and security of the people of Springfield became a paramount concern. Amidst the chaos, authorities continued their investigation. A comprehensive search of the entire area was conducted, which led to a significant discovery. Ejected casings from a spent .22 caliber firearm. The casings matched the bullet wounds inflicted on the members of Down's family. Investigators at this point didn't have a lot to go on, though they had their suspicions about Diane. They basically did not have any evidence to establish her guilt. That was when they came up with an idea. For the most part, reenactments are not easy for the victims, especially when they have experienced the loss of their loved ones. It is expected that most people would be overwhelmed with emotion and may cry while reenacting the most terrible moments of their lives. However, it was Diane Downs whose reenactment video would forever be remembered as one of the most disturbing ones in history. Alarmingly, Not only was she seen giggling and joking, but she was even filmed fixing her makeup during the reenactment. It was enough to make the investigators' hair stand on end. Investigators knew that in order to understand the strange woman and piece together the case, they needed to delve deeper into her personal life. Elizabeth Diane Fredrickson, who went by her middle name, was born on August 7, 1955, in Phoenix, Arizona, to her parents Wesley Lyndon Fredrickson and Willa Dean Fredrickson. Diane would grow up in what appeared to be the typical American family of the 1950s and 1960s, with her 3 younger brothers and 1 younger sister. Although Diane excelled at her studies, she was not at all popular in school. In fact, throughout her education, she was picked on by the other children, mostly because she came from a family with strict conservative values, and her parents forbade her to wear fashionable clothes or makeup. In her early years, Diane was a shy child, but that changed when she reached the age of 14, and she developed a tendency to talk compulsively. Diane graduated from Moon Valley High School in Phoenix, where she encountered her high school sweetheart, Stephen Downs, when she was just 15 years old. Despite her parents' disapproval, Diane continued the relationship with Steve, who was just 7 months older than her. They stayed together for the remainder of high school, but their path diverged when Steve enlisted in the Navy in June 1972. After high school, Diane enrolled at Pacific Coast Baptist Bible College, located in Orange, California. However, her time at college was short-lived, as she was expelled after just 1 year due to alleged promiscuous behavior. Following her expulsion, Diane had no choice but to return to her parents' home in Arizona. Diane had a stifling atmosphere at home, as her parents constantly tried to clip her wings. Desperate to break free from the confines of her home life, she reconciled with Steve, eventually marrying him in November 1973. Diane was just 18 at the time. From the very beginning, their marriage was shaky at best. Additionally, the couple frequently fought over financial matters and accused each other of being unfaithful. Diane craved love and attention, only to discover Steve could not provide it. Diane found solace when she became pregnant, despite the ongoing problems in her marriage. Surprisingly, she didn't consult Stephen about getting pregnant. She just stopped using her birth control, and she didn't regret the decision. Diane relished being pregnant, as it seemed to earn her the love and attention she had always desired. In October 1974, Diane gave birth to her first child, Christy. A pregnancy only lasted for a few months, and once it ended, Diane missed the attention she used to receive. So she once again stopped using birth control without informing her husband. As a result, Cheryl Lynn, their second child, was born in January 1976. But as much as she enjoyed being pregnant, she did not derive the same pleasure from actually raising her children. According to Steve Downs, Diane would frequently neglect her children. Their fights would sometimes lead her to take the kids and run away from Steve, but she always returned eventually. After Cheryl's birth, Steve made the decision that he didn't want any more children. He couldn't trust his wife with birth control, so he opted for a vasectomy. However, despite this procedure, Diane ended up getting pregnant again, but she chose to terminate the pregnancy. In 1978, the couple relocated to Mesa, Arizona. It was there that Diane engaged in multiple affairs with her coworkers. One such affair with one of her male friends, Mark Sager, resulted in becoming pregnant once again. This time she decided to carry the child to term, and in December 1979, Stephen Danny Daniel was born. A final attempt to salvage their marriage, Stephen accepted Danny as his own, even though he knew he wasn't the father. Yet less than a year later they got divorced. The children stayed with their mother. When the marriage ended, Diane didn't have a stable job. In her attempt to support herself, she pursued becoming a surrogate mother, but faced setbacks. She failed 2 psychiatric exams, one of which indicated that she was psychotic. Rather than being concerned, Diane found this amusing and would boast about it to her friends. In 1981, Diane finally secured a full-time job as a postal carrier in Chandler, Arizona. During her working hours, she would send her children to stay with various family members. However, concerns were raised by neighbors about the well-being of the children when they were in their mother's care. According to the neighbors, the children would often be hungry and would beg for food. In cold weather, they would not be adequately dressed in coats or suitable shoes. It was reported that if Diane couldn't find a babysitter, she would leave her 6-year-old daughter, Christine, in charge of the other children. One neighbor even mentioned that Cheryl had expressed fear of her own mother. Despite the alleged negligence of her own children, later in the same year, Diane was finally accepted into a surrogate program. In May 1982, Diane gave birth to a girl named Jennifer and surrendered her to her parents in exchange for $10,000. In February of 1983, just a few months before the shooting incident, Diane returned to Springfield, Oregon to be closer to her parents. Despite the relocation, she maintained her employment as a postal worker. Despite Diane's unstable life, nobody could have anticipated the tragedy that would engulf her family just months later. As the investigation into Diane's past unfolded, she seemed to develop a newfound interest in giving interviews. It was evident that Diane enjoyed being in the spotlight and the attention that came with it. Within a few days of the tragic incident, she eagerly gave multiple interviews appearing with full hair and makeup. She would retell her story over and over, emphasizing her pain while frequently downplaying her children's fate. She made this claim even after knowing that the bullet had caused significant damage to his spine and posed a risk of permanent paralysis. Diane may have intended to elicit sympathy from the public through these interviews, but it just had the opposite effect. Instead of garnering support, her behavior and demeanor during the interview began to raise suspicion and doubt among viewers. People noted instances where she appeared to laugh or make light of the gruesome details of that fateful night. These actions, along with the inconsistencies in her narrative, caused public opinion to shift, viewing Diane less as a grieving mother and more as a potential perpetrator. As Diane noticed the shift in public perception, she attempted to counter the growing suspicion by posting contrasting questions. What Diane didn't know was that there was one person who had witnessed the truth she had so desperately tried to cover up. Joseph Inman was behind Diane's car that night and saw something that completely contradicted Diane's story. Diane's story didn't make sense from the start. After all, what would a stranger have to gain by shooting the children? If he had wanted the car, he could have just shot her, the only adult present at the scene, and taken the car. Furthermore, the forensic evidence pointed towards a different scenario. Bloodstains were found on the side door of the front seat, where Cheryl had been shot, and on the rear seat where Danny and Christine had been hit, but there was no blood on the driver's side. If Diane had been shot as she described, it would be expected for her to instinctively grab the wound with her other hand, resulting in blood being present on her hand and the steering wheel. Additionally, the location of the gunpowder residue indicated that the shooter was likely seated in the driver's seat, casting further doubt on Diane's account. However, there was one interview that Diane Downs would give in November 1983 that would send shockwaves throughout the nation. People couldn't believe the level of narcissism displayed during the interview with reporter and Yeager for Kessie News. In a shocking audacity, she even stated that her kids were luckier than her and made jokes about it. Needless to say, it was a surreal experience for the viewers as they witnessed firsthand the depths of Diane's self-centeredness and lack of empathy. The lack of trust and suspicion surrounding Diane Downs went far beyond the media and law enforcement. Diane's own father casted doubts on her account and must have taken him an immense amount of courage to say this about his own daughter. But he too could not shake off the feeling that something didn't sit right. But the case against Diane Downs was still weak. All the evidence was circumstantial. The disturbing behavior exhibited by her and the inconsistencies in her story were not sufficient to directly establish her guilt in the crime. The case hinged on the other two witnesses, Christy and Danny. Unfortunately, Danny, being only 3 years old at the time of the attack, was too young to remember any significant information about the incident. This left Christy as the potential key witness. However, Christy's ability to communicate was severely impacted due to the stroke she suffered. Although there was hope, no one was sure if she would ever be able to speak normally. Yet every time her mother entered the room, Christy's eyes glazed over with apparent fear and her heart rate significantly increased. In light of the overall circumstances and the need to ensure the safety and well-being of the children, the state made the decision to remove custody from Diane. It was determined that the children would be placed into foster care once they were released from the hospital. With each passing day, Diane became increasingly careless and overconfident in her demeanor. She even went as far as challenging the police to arrest her, as she firmly believed they did not have enough evidence to incriminate her. At the same time, the police were still grappling with the lack of a clear motive for the murder. The strongest forensic evidence they had was the 22 bullet shells discovered at the crime scene, but the absence of a murder weapon hindered their progress. Faced with limited leads, detectives decided to visit Diane's apartment in the hopes of finding any additional clues. The first notable piece of evidence that the detectives found at Diane's home was a diary. It served as a treasure trove of information about Diane's life after she had moved to Chandler in 1982. While working as a postal carrier, Diane involved herself in multiple affairs with married co-workers. One of them, however, would alter the course of her life permanently. In July 1982, Diane Downs began an affair with Robert Knickerbocker, a fellow coworker who was married to a woman named Charlene. At the time, he was having problems with Charlene and was looking for a distraction. Diane never meant anything more than a fling to him, and he had no intention of leaving his wife. However, to Diane, he was her greatest love. In her diary, Diane mentioned how she never loved anybody more than she loved Nick, her affectionate nickname for him. She fantasized about building a life and starting a family with him. She was so interested in him that she rented an apartment and even got a tattoo of a large rose with his name beneath it. That was not the case with Nick. Throughout the 9 months of their affair, Nick's commitment wavered between Diane and his wife Charlene. In February of 1983, Diane's pursuit of Nick reached a breaking point. She began pressuring him to divorce his wife, and he finally confessed that he loved his wife, Charlene, more than he loved Diane. He also made it clear that he had no desire to have children, and he didn't intend to become the stepfather to her children either. In an attempt to manipulate the situation, Diane requested a transfer from Chandler to Springfield, Oregon, where her parents lived. She believed that this move would intimidate Nick and make him run back to her. She even asked her father, Wes, who also worked for the Postal Service, to help Nick find a job in Oregon. However, once Diane left Arizona, Nick gained clarity and realized that he didn't want to move to Springfield or be with Diane. He decided to stay with his wife and refused Diane's mail and calls, marking the definitive end of their relationship. Despite the end of their relationship in April of 1983, Diane's infatuation with Nick continued to consume her thoughts and writings. She expressed her longings for him, both physically and emotionally, even after everything she held on to the hope that he would eventually come back to her. Surprisingly or not surprisingly, her lingering feelings for Nick did not stop her from sleeping with other men, beginning just 7 days after her arrival in Springfield. When the police searched her home, they found that Diane had kept 2 of Nick's pictures with her own pictures on top of the television. But there were no pictures of the kids. The detectives made an observation that Diane seldom wrote about her children, Christy, Cheryl, and Danny, in her diary. The majority of her diary entries revolved around Nick. However, on May 11, 1983, just 8 days before the shootings, Diane's focus abruptly shifted. It was as if she had suddenly rediscovered her children and started describing them as fantastic, smart, and sweet. She portrayed her family as a tight-knit group, referring to themselves as the Four Musketeers, and expressing a newfound love for them that supposedly surpassed feelings for Nick. Investigators believed that at this point, Diane had already made plans to kill him. It was not just another red flag. The detectives believed they had finally found the motive for the crime. According to them, Diane saw her children as thorns in her side. She believed that removing her children from the picture would make her become more appealing to Nick, and that he would then be willing to provide emotional support and comfort in the aftermath of the tragic event. It wasn't the only incriminating evidence police found at Diane's home. They also found a few on-fire .22 caliber shell casings with extractor markings. When detectives asked Diane if she owned any .22 caliber firearms, she denied this vehemently. But both Steve Downs and Robert Knickerbocker confirmed that she did in fact own one such firearm. The detectives approached Nick and requested his assistance in obtaining a confession from Diane. By exploiting her weakness towards him, he agreed to cooperate and made a few calls to Diane. During the call, Diane primarily focused on her own experiences and emotions, particularly her physical pain and the need for emotional support. Yet she failed to express concern about the well-being of her surviving children. In one call, Nick told Diane that he didn't believe her story. Whether Robert Knickerbocker was worth murder to Diane Downs or not, she did not confess to the crime. At this point, detectives were no longer playing on the surface. They confronted her directly and made it clear that she was the primary focus of their investigation. Realizing that sarcasm wouldn't save her, Diane changed her story. She claimed that there was no bushy-haired stranger, but instead it was 2 men wearing ski masks who attacked her and her children. According to Diane, the men knew her as they called her by name. Throughout a 2-hour period, the detectives relentlessly probed her for the truth. And as they neared the conclusion, her frustration reached a boiling point. The tape ended with Diane storming out of the sheriff's office, unable to put up with the questions. A month passed after the shooting. The pressure was mounting on law enforcement to make an arrest. By the beginning of 1984, police had gathered all the evidence pointing towards the prime suspect, Diane. However, they eagerly awaited Christie's recovery, as she was the only person who could provide them with a first-hand account of what truly transpired. Christie's healing process was slow but steady, and she eventually regained her ability to speak, despite her initial fear. With the help of therapists working tirelessly with her for months, Christie mustered the courage to eventually reveal the truth. It was a truth that would put an end to all the speculations surrounding the case. Confirming what many had already suspected, Christie unequivocally declared that her own mother, Diane Downs, was the one who shot her and her siblings on that fateful night. On February 28, 1984, nearly 9 months after the shooting, Diane was finally arrested. Diane pleaded not guilty to all charges, and thus the case proceeded to trial. However, Diane Downs was not one to go down so easily. When her trial commenced in June 1984, she shocked the nation by appearing visibly pregnant, leaving everyone speechless. As it turned out, back in October of 1983, while working as a postal carrier, Diane seduced a young teacher and ended up becoming pregnant. Diane said she felt lonely without her children. The prosecution, however, saw it as Diane's way of gaining sympathy. The trial of Diane Downs became a national spectacle, with hundreds of people lining up each day in hopes of securing a seat in the courtroom. Though cameras were not allowed inside the courtroom, the media closely followed the trial. The jury was comprised of 9 women and 3 men. The trial lasted a month. The prosecutor, Fred Hugie, had a solid case against Diane. The evidence against Diane appeared insurmountable. Along with the bullet casings and blood spatter, Hugie called upon a number of witnesses, including Heather Plord, Joseph Inman, Stephen Downs, and Robert Knickerbocker. They all testified against Diane. Defense attorney Jim Jagger made every effort to present Diane Downs' version of events, emphasizing the involvement of a bushy-haired stranger. Diane herself took the stand and reiterated her story, staunchly maintaining her innocence. However, she struggled to provide a convincing explanation for the inconsistencies in her account. Diane also testified that she had been physically abused by her father on multiple occasions, which impacted her future decisions, a disturbing claim that Diane's family denied. The jury viewed this claim as a lie intended to invoke sympathy, and Diane's family denied the allegations as well. The most anticipated witness of this trial was Christine Downs. With utmost bravery, then 9-year-old Christie, still suffering with a speech impediment, took the stand to recount the night of May 19, 1983. Christie's recollection of the events on May 19, 1983, was vivid and haunting. She remembered the moments leading up to the shooting,